guys, welcome to Budget Commander. On this week's episode, we have a competitive Jhoira the Weatherlight Captain deck at a $100 budget. If you haven't already subscribed to our YouTube channel, we are running a contest until the end of March where we're giving out last week's deck for free, Muldrotha of the Gravetide, to one of our lucky listeners. All you have to do is subscribe to our YouTube channel, we'll earn you an entry, and if you comment on any of our videos, that will also earn you an entry. The contest is running until March 31st, and we will do a live stream video to declare a winner. It's a great idea to subscribe as we will be doing more giveaways in the future. Jhoira Weatherlight Captain is 2, a blue and a red for legendary creature, human artificer out of Domanaria. It says, whenever you cast a historic spell, draw a card. Artifacts, legendaries, and sagas are historic. So with this deck, we are going to play a storm strategy. It is very all-in combo. But with this deck, we're just trying to do our own thing. We're not going to lean heavily on interaction. We're basically trying to play our Jhoira, play artifacts out, and chain together a win off of drawing cards off of playing artifacts. And we're eventually going to win through storm. We do have a couple alternate win cons in the deck, which we'll go over later on in the video. But our main way to win is through storming off and playing a bunch of spells in one turn, which is easy to do in this deck if you have a Jhoira hit the battlefield. In this Jhoira deck, we're leaning heavily on artifacts as we're going to play them with the Jhoira on the battlefield and try to storm off all in the same turn. So we do have 43 artifacts in the deck, a lot of which are mana rocks and mana producing creatures, which we have 21 of those included in the deck as well. And then we have 31 lands in the deck with an average CMC of 2.1 and so much ramp in this deck. 31 lands is more than enough, even though compared to some other decks, it may not seem like a lot. We have 6 removal spells, almost all of which are single targeted. We have 8 counter spells to ensure that our Jhoira hits the battlefield and has a little bit of backup in case somebody tries to counter her or remove her from the battlefield. And then we also have 5 cost reducing spells that are going to make our artifacts cheaper to play, which is going to make it easier to storm off in the single turn. The price of this deck is $100.03 on TCG Player. If you use the link to the TCG Player deck builder down below, it will help support the channel and help us create content in the future. Alright guys, so for our mana base, we do have 31 lands in the deck. First up, we have Spire of Industry. Tap it to add a colorless to your mana pool. Tap it, pay 1 life, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. Activate this ability only if you control an artifact. Then we have Buried Ruin. Tap it for colorless, pay 2 and tap it. Sacrifice Buried Ruin, return target artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. This works out really well if your opponents are able to get rid of your artifacts. You're able to bring them back with the Buried Ruin. Then we have Inventor's Fair. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 3 or more artifacts, gain 1 life. Tap it, add 1 colorless to your mana pool, and then pay 4, tap it, and sacrifice it. Search your library for an artifact card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. Activate this ability only if you control 3 or more artifacts. So this is a great budget way to search our deck for some of our powerful artifacts that we have in here. Then we have 3 artifact lands in the deck. So we do have Great Furnace and Seed of the Synod. They both tap for colored mana. So Great Furnace taps for a red and Seed of the Synod taps for a blue. And then we have Darksteel Citadel, Indestructible, tap it to add a colorless. These work out really well with our artifact synergies in the deck. Then we have Command Tower, which is a staple in budget commander decks. Costs about $2 and tap it and add 1 color of any color in your commander's color identity. Just really great in any commander deck that you're playing. And then rounding out our mana base, we do have 16 islands in the deck and 8 mountains. We are playing a lot more blue cards in the deck, so we're leaning more heavily on islands. I do want to call special attention to the artifact and mana rocks that we have in this deck. So we have 21 ways to ramp in this deck, 16 of which are mana rocks, which provide utility in 2 different ways in this deck. So most of these mana rocks cost 2 mana, so they'll come down on turn 2, which ensures that we're able to untap on turn 3 and play our Jhoira, which is the most important thing that we can do in this deck is get our Jhoira on the battlefield. And then if you draw any of these off the top of your library later on in the game, they are a cheap way to draw a card with Jhoira on the battlefield, and then also provide you additional mana when you're trying to storm off with your Paradox Engine, your Aetherflux Reservoir. So you do want a lot of these in the deck. In addition, there are a few artifacts that you can pay a cost and sacrifice it to draw a card. This also works out really well with Jhoira. So you're able to play your Mind Stone, for example, for 2 mana, and then you could pay 1, sack it to draw an additional card to keep churning through your deck to make sure that you're able to continue storming off. This also works out really well with Scrap Trawler, which we have in the deck. As when you sack your Mind Stone, you're able to get something back for 1 mana that you may have in your graveyard. So in our ramp, we do have a combination of two cards that work really well together. So we have Basalt Monolith, 3 colorless for an artifact. Basalt Monolith doesn't untap during your untap step. Tap it, add 3 colorless mana to your mana pool, and then you can pay 3 to untap Basalt Monolith. And then we have Voltaic Key, 1 colorless mana for an artifact. Pay 1 and tap it, untap target artifact. So with the Basalt Monolith and Voltaic Key on the battlefield, you're able to tap your Basalt Monolith for 3, pay 1 for the Voltaic Key to untap it to make 3 more mana. Basalt Monolith is also an infinite combo with a couple different cards. So you have Rings of Brighthearth. If you have that card, you could include that in this deck. With a Rings of Brighthearth on the battlefield, you're able to combo with Basalt Monolith to make infinite mana. And then you also have Power Artifact is another way to make your Basalt Monolith produce infinite mana. You could also use this with a Grim Monolith, although that card costs over $100 currently. In this deck, cost reduction is really important. So we have several ways that we're able to reduce the cost of our artifact spells or colorless spells in this deck that help us storm off. So first up, we have Ethereum Sculptor, 1 in a blue, artifact spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Then we have Herald of Kozilek, 1 blue and a red for a devoid creature that has colorless spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. And then we have Foundry Inspector, 3 colorless, artifact spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. And then we have Jhoira's Familiar, 4 colorless mana for a flying creature. Historic spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, and heroic spells are artifacts, legendaries, and sagas. And then we have Helm of the Awakening, 2 colorless for an artifact. All spells cost 1 generic mana less to play, so this does work for your opponent's spells as well. All of these spells work out really well with Jhoira, as you're able to play some of your artifacts for less mana and storm off. There are several spells in this deck that don't cost any mana off the bat. We decided to only include ones that had a relevant ability attached to them. So first up we have Tormod's Crypt, 0 for an artifact, tap it, sacrifice Tormod's Crypt, exile all cards from target player's graveyard. So this works out great if you're going up against a graveyard synergy deck. You're able to exile their graveyard at instant speed, which works out really well, especially for 0 mana. Then we have Urza's Bauble, 0 for an artifact, tap it, sacrifice Urza's Bauble, look at a card at random in target player's hand. You draw a card at the beginning of next turn's upkeep. So this card replaces itself, and if you have a Jhoira on the battlefield, you're going to draw an additional card as well. Then we have Closet Gix, 0 for an artifact, pay 1, sacrifice a permanent, you gain 1 life. So this is a good way to get around exile effects and have a sacrifice outlet on the battlefield in case you need one. The next 2 cards are artifacts that provide a little bit of interaction that you're able to slow down your opponents. So we have Pithing Needle, 1 colorless mana for an artifact. As Pithing Needle enters the battlefield, name a card. Activated abilities of sources with the chosen name can't be activated unless they're mana abilities. And then we have Phyrexian Revoker, 2 colorless for an artifact creature horror that has the exact same ability as Pithing Needle, except it can't target a non-land card. These work out really well if you have a problematic commander that has an activated ability or a planeswalker. You're able to stop them from being able to activate that ability with these cards on the battlefield. And they're also really cheap, so you're able to play these for next to nothing, and you're able to get a card draw if you have Jhoira on the battlefield. The next 2 cards provide some utility in that you're able to use them to bounce a non-land permanent, either for yourself or a problematic permanent that an opponent may have played. So first up we have Echoing Truth, 1 in a blue for an instant. Return target non-land permanent and all other permanents with the same name as that permanent to their owner's hands. Then we have Chain of Vapor, 1 blue for an instant. Return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. Then that permanent's controller may sacrifice a land. If the player does, he or she may copy this spell and may choose a new target for that copy. So these are great ways if you need to bounce a mana rock, for example, to get another card draw off Jhoira or make some additional mana. You're able to bounce your artifact, or you could save an artifact if somebody's trying to exile it. Or if you have a problematic permanent that your opponent has out, say like a Stony Silence, it does provide a little bit of flexibility in this deck. Bouncing your artifacts in this deck is really important as you're able to pick up all your artifacts and replay them, especially since most of your artifacts cost a lower converted mana cost. You'll be able to bounce all your artifacts, return them all to your hand, and then replay them with the Jhoira on the battlefield and draw even more cards. So first up we have Hurkyl's Recall, 1 in a blue, return all artifacts target player owns to his or her hand. So you could use this on yourself, but if you're also going up against another artifact heavy deck, you could also use it against your opponent if you needed to. Then we have Paradoxical Outcome, 3 in a blue for an instant. Return any number of target non-land, non-token permanents you control to their owner's hands. Draw a card for each card returned to your hand this way. This is really powerful in this deck because you're able to return all your artifacts that you control to your hand. And then every one that you return, you draw a card. And then when you replay all those cards and you have your Jhoira on the battlefield, you're able to draw even more cards off of this. Then we have Rebuild, 2 in a blue for an instant, return all artifacts to owner's hands. So this does work for you and also your opponents if they have some pesky artifacts out as well. This also does have cycling, so if you don't need this card, you can always cycle it away and get a card off. The card that I want to call special attention to is Scrap Trawler. It's 3 colorless mana for an artifact creature construct from Aether Revolt, and it says whenever Scrap Trawler or another artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, return to your hand target artifact card in your graveyard with lesser converted mana cost. Now this works out really well if an opponent is able to get rid of some of your artifacts and you have a Scrap Trawler on the battlefield. You could sack an artifact, which we do have sacrifice outlets in this deck, to be able to get back one of your other artifacts at a lesser cost from your graveyard. This also works out well with Mind Stone and Lockets. You're able to sacrifice them and then get back a 2 mana cost or 1 mana cost card from your graveyard. It's just able to provide you with additional value in this deck, and it works out really well with Jhoira. The most important card in this deck is definitely Paradox Engine. It's one of the most powerful cards in Commander. So Paradox Engine is a 5 mana cost legendary artifact out of Aether Revolt, and it says whenever you cast a spell, untap all non-land permanents you control. Now this card is a little bit under $20, so it did chew up a bunch of our budget, but I do feel like it is worth it, especially in a budget build. To have something this powerful in this deck is definitely going to put you ahead, and it's going to make this deck feel like it's not budget if you get this resolved onto the battlefield. So the way the Paradox Engine works is if you have a Jhoira on the battlefield and you have a couple mana rocks, so you'll be able to chain together a bunch of spells and store them off, and then use our main win con, which is Aetherflux Reservoir out of Kaladesh. It costs 4 colorless mana for an artifact, and it says whenever you cast a spell, you gain 1 life for each spell you've cast this turn. Pay 50 life, Aetherflux Reservoir deals 50 damage to target creature or player. Now this does stack, so if you play this after you already played 10 spells, for example, and then you cast your 11th spell, you're going to gain 11 life. When you cast your 12th spell, you'll gain 12 life, and it's just going to keep going up until you get to that magic 50 number, and then you win the game. Now, if our main game plan is disrupted and we're not able to win off of an Aetherflux Reservoir, we did include a few other ways to win the game, but they're not going to be as fast as the Aetherflux Reservoir plan. So first up, we have Grape Shot. 1 in a red for sorcery. Grape Shot deals 1 damage to target creature or player. It does have Storm. This is the other Storm win con that we have in this deck, and it can win you the game, although it's going to be a lot slower than having Aetherflux Reservoir on the battlefield. Then we have Efficient Construction, 3 in a blue for an enchantment. Whenever you cast an artifact spell, create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying. This is going to give you some ways to make more artifacts, which are going to help you with your artifact synergies in this deck. It's also going to give you a way to win if you amass enough Thopters, so you're able to swing in for a significant amount of damage throughout the game. We also have Psy Master Thopterus in the deck, 2 in a blue for legendary creature Human Artificer. It says whenever you cast an artifact spell, create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying. You can pay 1 in a blue to sacrifice 2 artifacts, draw a card. So it has the same thing as Efficient Construction, and it also has a sacrifice outlet attached to it that gives you card advantage throughout the game. Then we have the Antiquities War, 3 in a blue for a Saga. On 1, look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may reveal an artifact card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. On 2, it's going to do the exact same thing. And then on 3, artifacts you control become artifact creatures with base power and toughness 5/5 until end of turn. This is a great way to pump all your artifacts that you have on the battlefield that you're not using to be able to swing in for 5 points of damage each to close out a game pretty quickly. Then we have Psychosis Crawler in the deck. It's 5 colorless mana for an artifact creature horror. Psychosis Crawler's power and toughness are each equal to the number of cards in your hand, and whenever you draw a card, each opponent loses 1 life. You will be drawing a lot of cards with your Jhoira on the battlefield. Then we have Reckless Fireweaver, 1 in a red for a creature Human Artificer. Whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, Reckless Fireweaver deals 1 damage to each opponent. So we will be playing a lot of artifacts. We have 40 or so in the deck, so that's going to be 40 or so damage if you're able to play them all with the Reckless Fireweaver on the battlefield. I want to point out 2 cards that could go into this deck that provide a really powerful engine for an infinite combo and an infinite mana. I didn't include them in this deck because I didn't have enough in my budget to include them, but they do come in at around $6 total to add this package in. So first up, you have Isochron Scepter, 2 colorless mana for an artifact, Imprint. When Isochron Scepter enters the battlefield, you may exile an instant card with converted mana cost 2 or less from your hand. Pay 2 and tap it. You may copy the exiled card. When you do, you may cast the copy without paying its mana cost. Then we have Dramatic Reversal, 1 and a blue for an instant. Untap all non-land permanents you control. So what you do is you play your Isochron Scepter with your Dramatic Reversal in your hand. You imprint the Dramatic Reversal on the Scepter, and then you can pay 2 and tap the Isochron Scepter to put a copy of Dramatic Reversal on the stack to untap all non-land permanents you control. Now what you would need to do is have several mana rocks on the battlefield in order to tap them in response to the Dramatic Reversal on the stack. Then when Dramatic Reversal resolves, it's going to untap all your artifact. If you have 3 colorless mana worth of mana rocks or more, you will generate 1 additional mana every time you do this. In addition, it will also count for storm. So every time you're able to do this, it will produce a storm count for you. So if you're able to get your Aetherflux Reservoir, you are able to win the game on the spot with your Isochron Scepter and Dramatic Reversal combo. This is a really powerful combo that's included in a lot of CEDH decks. Let's talk about some cards that you can upgrade later on when building the budget deck. These are all non-budget additions and they do cost a lot of money. The most important cards that you'd want to add into here are going to be the more expensive mana rocks that you would just replace your cheaper mana rocks with later on down the road. So first up, we have Mana Vault, 1 mana for an artifact. Mana Vault doesn't untap during your untap step. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may pay 4. If you do, untap Mana Vault. At the beginning of your draw step, if Mana Vault is tapped, it deals 1 damage to you. Tap it to add 3 colorless to your mana pool. Then we have Grim Monolith, 2 colorless for an artifact. Grim Monolith does not untap during your untap step. Tap it to add 3 colorless mana to your mana pool, and you can pay 4 to untap Grim Monolith. Then we have Mox Diamond, 0 for an artifact. When Mox Diamond enters the battlefield, you may discard a land card from your hand. If you do, put Mox Diamond onto the battlefield. If you don't, put it into its owner's graveyard. Tap to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. Then we have Mana Crypt, 0 for an artifact. At the beginning of your upkeep, flip a coin. If you lose the flip, Mana Crypt deals 3 damage to you. Tap it to add 2 colorless to your mana pool. Then we have Chromox, 0 for an artifact. It has Imprint. When Chromox enters the battlefield, you may exile a non-artifact, non-land card from your hand. Tap it to add 1 mana of any color of the exile card's colors to your mana pool. Then we have Mox Opal, 0 for a legendary artifact. Metalcraft, tap it. Add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. Activate this ability only if you control 3 or more artifacts. Then the last artifact we have in this deck is Mox Amber from Domanaria. 0 for a legendary artifact. Tap it. Add 1 mana of any color among legendary creatures and planeswalkers you control. Then we have a couple cards that work out really well in this deck that actually aren't that expensive, but we just didn't have the budget for them. So we have Semblance Anvil, 3 colorless for an artifact that has Imprint. When Semblance Anvil enters the battlefield, you may exile a non-land card from your hand. Spells you cast that share a card type, the exile card, cost 2 less to cast. So this works out really well with our other mana reducers to make our artifacts even cheaper. This card did just go up in price. It was about a $2-3 card for a long time, and it's just went up to $8 just recently. Then we have Vidalcan Archmage, 2 blue for a creature. Whenever you play an artifact spell, draw a card. So this is a great way to have redundancy with Jhoira's ability. If your Jhoira gets killed and you're not able to recast it, you're able to play the Vidalcan Archmage and have the same effect on the board. Then we have Retract, 1 blue, return all artifacts you control to their owner's hands. So as we saw earlier, returning artifacts to your hand is really important in this deck to be able to store them off if you need them. And Retract just gives you a really cheap, effective way to return them to your hand at only $7. If it were me, I would focus on getting the cheaper cards first, like the Semblance Anvil, the Vidalcan Archmage, and the Retract, and maybe even the Mox Amber, and then work your way up to some of the more expensive cards as you can. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't already, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell notification icon to get updates when our new videos post. We will have more giveaways in the future, and it's a great way to support the channel.